Good morning, everyone. So, from myself and Diane Butler, we'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our second annual teaching conference. Last year's face-to-face event seems quite a long time ago now, and will reflect some of the changes that we've seen over the last year in a session later today with some of our invited speakers in our panel session. But clearly, the advantage of offering this event online is made it much easier for some of our staff, particularly those based remotely, to participate. And we're particularly pleased to see so many of our associate lecturers sign up for this event. We've got a grand total of 345 participants registered for today's event, so it's quite a considerable number. So a very warm welcome to you, and particularly to our 4 invited speakers and to everyone who has volunteered to present today. Some volunteered more easily than others, but it was very nice to have quite so many people volunteering. And as ever, there's lots of people behind the scenes that have made this event happen. And Diane and myself are really grateful, in particular for the input of Michelle Leonard, Jamie Sawyer, Babette Oliver, and Keith Hamilton, who have gone the sort of extra mile to make sure this is as organised as it is. So we're very, very grateful for everyone who's had an involvement in getting this conference to the state that it is. So in terms of how the day will run, you should have all received a mailing from Michelle Leonard. It came on the 1st of March, and there's a STEM teaching conference programme booklet attached. And the booklet is particularly important as it contains all the hyperlinks for the different remote meeting rooms we'll be using today. We'll be putting some of them up on screen at the end of the plenary session as well. But if you use that booklet, I can say it has those links which will be able to take you to the rooms that you want to go in. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker. It's Dr. Winston Morgan, who's a reader in toxicology and clinical biochemistry, and is also Director of Impact and Innovation at the School of Health, Sport and Bioscience at the University of East London. So Dr. Morgan's going to give his presentation, and there'll be a question and answer session after it. So can I ask that any questions you've got for Dr. Morgan are placed in the chat box, and we'll select from those. So I'm going to hand over to Winston for his presentation now, entitled Attainment Gaps, the Role and Impact of Tutor Bias Linked to Racialized Stereotypes.
Oh, wow. Good morning. I thought I was coming in slightly later than that, but thank you very much, Diane and the Open University, for inviting me. I think I was here about 5 years ago or so when I gave 2 sessions, I think, on a related topic. So what I'm going to do now, I have a sort of short background intro that I'm going to read, and then I'll go into my PowerPoint presentation by sharing my slides if the technology works. So I was initially asked to talk about how changes in assessment could reduce the university awarding gap. Now, this assumption being that the gap is down to the inability of students described as Black, Asian and minority ethnic to cope with the academic and cultural challenges faced by university study. For the past 25 years, that has been the working hypothesis, and although all solutions have been based on this flawed assumption, of this deficit assumption. 25 years ago, this may have been partially true. There were students, lots more students with deficits. But today, with widespread inclusive teaching practices, students coming to universities with what might be described as educational and social deficits can navigate their way through university successfully. So you can come in with deficits, but because we are so we become so skilled and adept at inclusive teaching, students with these deficits can navigate their way through university successfully. So today, widening participation, white students are awarded good degrees at the same level as students at Russell Group universities. A lot of people don't realize this. Importantly, and this is why I suppose I'm here and why I'm talking about this, this does not occur for Black students in particular. Even those who enter with no educational and social deficits and at our most selective universities. So even at our top universities where you have to jump through a million hurdles getting, and I'll come back to this in my presentation, you are still, as a Black student, likely to have an awarding gap. So something else is going on, and I want to switch the focus away from the student to the role of the tutor, and in particular, racialized bias in 3 areas which are essential to the awarding gap. I'll only have time really because I've got a limited amount of time to talk about one of these areas, but I'll mention all 3 and both now and in my presentation. First is what I describe as the allocation of academic privileges to students, perceptions about ability about students, and perceptions about who we think will commit academic misconduct. All of these issues, if you like, feed into the university awarding gap. Right, so now I'm going to try and share my screen and take you through my presentation. Okay, there we go. First of all, colleagues, can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, Winston.
Perfect.
No problem.
Perfect. Right, so let's start from the beginning. So as I said, I've slightly changed the title. It's called Allocation of Academic Privileges and whoops. And the degree awarding gap in STEM. As I said, I'm Dr. Winston Morgan. I'm a reader in toxicology and clinical biochemistry, but I've spent a lot of time in higher education looking at outcomes in higher education in terms of race and ethnicity. You may also have seen a lot of the work I've been doing in terms of COVID, but that's for another time. So my subtitle is Racialized Bias and the Role of the Tutor, because I believe the role of the tutor is key to the awarding gap. So why this conversation is important, why are we having this conversation? Well, we have to start from the understanding that we live in a highly racialized world, which means we view many things through the distorted prism of race. So everything we see, we generally see them through the distorted prism of race, especially in a society like ours. And all we have to do is look at the narratives around the impact of COVID and the COVID vaccine. I don't know if any of you saw the David HEA documentary last night. That was quite fascinating about how race and social factors and all kinds of things can play into outcomes. And this also occurs in education. So racialized bias leads to many inequalities in university outcomes for BME students and staff. We also have to remember these issues not only affect students, but they affect staff. And I will attempt to show that the awarding gap is the result of bias, not student deficits. And the reason I say that is that, as I said, we have now been able to sort of help students who come in with deficits to get through these deficits and to be successful if they're white. However, if they're black, those, the process doesn't seem to work. So we know it's not specifically about the students. There's something else going on, and that's what I want to explore. Okay, so why focus on the awarding gap? Well, the awarding gap is present in all universities, and as I said before, including our most selective universities, where students will come in with no deficits in terms of education or social. Some of their parents would have gone to universities. This doesn't seem to make a difference. Whereas if you're a white student, all of these things will help you to be more successful, but we can see these things not being a factor for BME, particularly black students. So currently, gaps vary in the sector from about 10% to over 40% for black students. Black students have the widest deficits. Students of Indian background and perhaps certain mixed race students in Russell Group universities have the lowest gaps, which is quite an interesting thing that we don't have time to explore also. So any gaps in outcomes based on race is an indicator of the inequalities at that university. So if you have gaps in your outcomes for your students, it's really highlighting the inequalities in the processes that you have in your university. So question for everyone who's here: do you know the gap for your module, for your program, for your department or your university? If you don't know that, that's one of the first things you should do after today, is go and find out what those gaps are. It's really, really important. Okay, so how does bias affect our teaching and the awarding gap? How does that actually feed in? What am I talking about? So whenever we interact with students, we make assumptions, particularly about who's a good student and who's a poor student. And bias is something I talk about all the time. I do lots of presentations on this topic, yet I always notice my own biases when I teach, and I have to constantly check myself. I check myself because I know I have biases, I acknowledge them, and I try and do something about them. But if you don't acknowledge you have biases, you're not going to do it, and you're just going to continue to work with these biases and if you like, teach and award students with these biases. So just to give you an example, what do we do when, for example, a good student does a poor piece of work, or a weak student, these are perceptions about students, does something above expectations, what we tend to do is we tend to double check, both for the good students. I know I've done that, thinking, right, where did the student go wrong? Did I miss something? And I'll actually look through that piece of work and try to find the, evidence of good work. Whereas with the weak student, I'm scrutinizing, thinking, have I overmarked, or is there something wrong here? And that is because we have biases about these students, and this type of behavior, this type of situation where the good student does something poor, or the weak student does something exceptional, it challenges our biases about certain students, and that's just the focus. Another thing as scientists, because I think this is a STEM conference and researchers, we select our students for our final year projects based on how well we think they're going to do. And that's another way in which we sort of use our biases about students. So if we have an important project, we're going to try and get the students that we think are going to be really good and successful on those projects. And all of these things will lead into the awarding gap later on. So I just want to sort of highlight this and come back to it later. But how could this impact on student outcomes? How could all of these biases impact on student outcomes? If we look at student hurdles to a good degree mark, remember, a good degree is what the awarding gap is about, those who get a good degree versus those who don't get a good degree. Remember, a good degree is a 2-1 or a first. And what role does the tutor play? So if we look at the 3 hurdles to a good degree, the work that the student produces has to be at the good degree level. That sounds obvious, but is it actually a hurdle? You have to get a student to get up to that level. The next thing is it has to be awarded a mark at that level. So not only does the student have to do the work at the level, the tutor has to then decide has to agree that this work is at that level. And that's not as simple as you might think. And then the final one, the work must be free from questions about ownership. So you can have a student who does a good piece of work, the tutor awards that work at a good degree level, but the tutor has some questions about, did the student do this work? Is there questions about academic misconduct? And all of these are going to play a role in whether a student is awarded or not. And a lot of these, as I said, all these are value judgments. Despite what we think we're objective and that kind of thing, the tutor is a key decision maker at all 3 stages. Any bias they hold will affect the mark and classification of a degree. So let me explore this a bit more about tutor bias and how this can work, and the things I talked about previously around academic privileges. So in terms of the degree awarding gap, tutor bias is most impactful in 3 principal areas. What I call allocation of academic privileges. These are actions by a tutor which boost the student's performance. That's the hurdle one. Remember, a student has to perform at the good degree level, and there are actions which boost the student's performance. And these are academic privileges, I'll explain a bit more in a minute. Perceptions about ability. This influences, again, allocation of privilege. Remember, I said if you think you have an important project, you'll only give it to certain students. But also, perceptions about ability will impact on how we mark those students. Again, the example I gave about when a good student does something bad or a poor student does something exceptional, our perceptions will impact how we mark. We don't like to accept it, but there is something in there. Finally, there are perceptions about who we think will commit academic misconduct. Again, this third thing, and actions we subsequently take. All through FHEA, whenever I've seen a lot of data on this, academic misconduct, BAME students, Black, Asian and minority ethnic students, particularly Black students, are much more likely to be accused of academic misconduct and then convicted of academic misconduct. And all of these things will impact on whether a student makes their way through university and get a good degree. So they're really important. So why are academic privileges important? So let's explore these academic privileges and how they lead into the award of a good degree. So to be awarded marks necessary for a good degree, the work must have the appropriate content, style of communication, and criticality. All of these things we're looking for when we mark our students, and all must be familiar to and valued by the tutor. So the tutor must, familiar with what the work the students produce and value it. So a student can produce quite high quality work, but if the tutor doesn't recognize it and value it, they won't mark it as being good work. So students are more likely to acquire all the above, all these things, the appropriate content, communication, criticality that the tutor is going to be familiar with and appreciate through direct and close contact with their tutors. So if you don't have those direct and close contact with your tutors, it's not going to happen. So only if you have access, as I've just said. And remember, most of the damage, and that we're talking about the awarding gap damage, is done before the work is marked. So a student submits some work, but it's not of the quality that the tutor will recognize, and so they can then mark them accordingly. It's not because simply because the students didn't get these academic privileges. So let's go into what academic privileges are. Academic privileges could be, for example, selection for projects. I've mentioned that, internship, placements, any activities that comes with extra and special contact with tutor and their wider teams. And this gives these students who get these privileges a competitive advantage. It's really important. Okay. Information also provided in conversations outside direct contact teaching. So again, if you're in contact with your tutors, and there are lots of studies that have shown that white students are able to somehow have greater access and communication with their tutors compared to black students and BME students generally. And also messages which say you belong, you have access, you have ownership once you're on campus, once you're going about your daily life as a student. All of these things, these are academic privileges, and they give students a competitive advantage. So although most academics will accept the existence of bias generally, they are reluctant to accept it plays a role in, first of all, how they allocate academic privileges, perceptions about ability and academic misconduct. They're really reluctant to admit that. But unless you accept and admit this, you can't change your ideas and your practice. And what I'm trying to do is get colleagues, academics, to think about some of these things and see how you can change your behavior. And I'll give you how some of the kind of things you can do later on. So yet all of these are essential for creating and sustaining the university awarding gap. Now, I'm not a philosophy, but I just want to just some points about ontology and epistemology. I can't even say the word epistemology in STEM. So when you think of ontology, it's really about what is knowledge. And in terms of social science versus STEM, social science, you tend to have many truths. So there are many ways of getting to where you need to go. And in STEM, there's usually just one, and that's really important. And similar with epistemology, how we acquire knowledge, again, in social sciences, there tend to be many approaches, whereas in STEM, there's only one. And this means the role of the tutor in determining what is that single truth and what is that single approach in STEM gives the tutor a lot of power. So if you're not in close contact and working with that tutor and understanding what that tutor is after, you are not going to get those marks, get that good degree. So it's really important that we think about that. And it's a two-way process. Not only is it down to the student to become closer to the tutor has to make that possible for the students to do that. So how do you teach through these racialized biases? We have them, we have to acknowledge that we have them. How do we teach through them? Well, first of all, you need to start by reminding yourself that, first of all, as I said at the start, we live in a highly racialized world and we're affected by it. We can't pretend we're not affected by the highly racialized world we live in. We all have biases because we've been schooled in bias. As an American colleague of mine said, we've been schooled in bias from birth, and it's something that we live with. But we can mitigate our biases with the right approach. So to effectively teach BME students through racialized bias, you must overcome, and this is an important one, you must overcome two levels of bias. Level one, which is more conscious type bias, and that's where most people are in higher education. But in order to reduce and get rid of the awarding gap, we need to overcome our level two, that I call this level two unconscious type or implicit bias. And to illustrate this point, I now need to use a table. It's a clumsy table, but I think it makes the point. So on the top, we've got the level of bias that we need to overcome, examples of types of bias. I'm talking about actions we need to overcome these biases and what makes it easier, what mitigates this. So if we start with the level one types of bias, these are just simply perceptions about individuals from a particular racialized group. So this is an interesting one. Normally, to be able to teach BME students, you just have to think, can I teach students from this group? Now, this might sound pretty basic, but when I was a student, that was actually a challenge for some academics. Another example could be, can I work alongside a black colleague? All of these things, if we go back a period of time, Those were challenges for a lot of people. Now they're not so much challenges, and that's because we live in a multi-racial, multicultural area or country. So these things, they become normalized. We work at a university where there are lots of multiracial students. So again, we can overcome some of these things. It's globalization, and we have been trained, and we've done a lot of policies about bias. So we can overcome some of these challenges, and so we can easily teach students from different groups. We can work alongside our black colleagues quite happily. But these are still relatively superficial things we do. And what makes it easier is the power difference, because when we're teaching students, we have the power. We are the tutor, we are the lecturer. Also, again, we also have what I might term as real and perceived seniority. So we can overcome these sort of biases that we might have. We also, at this stage, can still allow deficit thinking, because we're the tutor. These students need our help. They're not as good as we are, and also it requires minimal, if you like, deep engagement in this process of overcoming our biases. But what is the consequence of this? So this level of adjustment that we make for the majority of people in higher education, it works for level 3, 4, and 5. I should have said at the start, the awarding gap really is about what happens at level 6. Okay, and so at level 4 and 5, using these things that I've described here, we can overcome quite a lot of things, including improving retention and progression. And so that's where most academics operate, partly because it's just pass or fail, but it has limited impact on the awarding gap. So without effectively tackling level 2, what I term implicit biases, gaps will never drop below the 10% that we want them to drop below. Some institutions, they have made lots of strides by doing some of the things I've said in the previous slide. So if we go back to the same set of categories again, but this time for level 2. So now we're thinking about perceptions about the qualities and ability of individuals from that racialized group. So let me go back actually and just remind you. So first of all, we're thinking about perceptions about just general perceptions about those. Now we're actually thinking about abilities and qualities. And to overcome those biases, we have to ask ourselves, not just can we teach these students, but can these students reach my level? And so you need to change your thinking, okay? And it's the same as, can my black colleague become my boss, okay? It's one thing to have a black colleague, but we now have to challenge ourselves in terms of, can my black colleague be my boss? That's a different thing altogether. Okay, or even something like as researchers, asking my black colleague for advice about a research problem in my specialist area I'm struggling with. Again, that's something that we find harder to do because of how we perceive our black colleagues or our black students. Okay, actions to overcome. Well, first of all, we need to overcome our level 1, our conscious biases, but then we have to go another step. We have to accept that we have biases that have real impact. We have to work hard to identify key areas where bias is likely to occur in our teaching. That's what we really need to work on it. And we need to make serious efforts to mitigate our biases. And contributing factors, again, it's becoming easier because we live in this racialized world, so which is both a problem and a solution. And we're, to a certain extent, over time, we're seeing reduced racialized inequalities. And there are more positive narratives about those racialized in a negative way. And another thing is there are real incentives and penalties by universities to overcome these biases. But it's really these level 2 biases that are going to impact on the awarding gap. So first steps in minimizing the racialized biases. First of all, denial about the gap, the awarding gap, is not an option. And I still think lots of colleagues still deny that the awarding gap is a real thing that we need to work on. So accepting the awarding gap is based on racialized stereotypes, some of the things I've said as well already. And we have collective and individual responsibilities to do something about it. So even if we have accepted the gap, we need to make sure all our colleagues accept the gap. So it's a collective thing, because if one academic is working enlightened, it's not going to work. Everyone has to work this way. And the other thing is, do not blame society, other lecturers, and definitely not the students. So we need to, again, really restrain from sort of blaming student deficits, because as I've said before, even if you take your students from the best universities with no deficits in terms of what student deficits are, they will still end up, if we don't challenge their biases, with an awarding gap. So let's have a look at academic privileges. Reflect on how much time you invest in your BME student, in conversations and feedback, and how this affects your assessment of their performance. Because if you don't know your BME students at a deeper level, you are likely to have those stereotypes about them. And so you really need to know them, understand them, and that will help you to overcome some of those biases. You might actually invite them to work with you on a project. Think about the profile of the students you speak about outside direct contact teaching. Okay, because some of the progress is made outside the normal teaching environment. So make genuine efforts to engage your BME students in informal settings, not just in the formal class. And when the class is over, you never see them, you never speak to them. Select more BME students for your research projects and other activities which enhance academic privileges. Remember, I talked about all of those different things that enhance academic privileges. Think about that all the time. Invest in those students and also allow them to invest in you. Okay, that's something to think about as well. So things that you need to do, again, on a personal level. Claiming to be colorblind is one of the things that you mustn't do. It's a big mistake, and it's also disingenuous because we all see color, we all see race. Let's not pretend, and our students expect us to see their color, their race, their ethnicity, but you don't have to necessarily make that a disadvantage, as I will say in a minute. So embrace and experience these differences of your students and colleagues. Do not hide from them, because remember, difference is not a deficit. So because a student is different from a different background, student or colleague rather, it doesn't mean that they have deficits. Really important. So in your scholarly activity, just as an exercise, actively seek out successful people from different racialized groups, regardless of field. The more you search, the more you'll find. You'll actually find quite a few in your field when you start to look. You'll be surprised. Even I have found that. And this exposure will help to break those biases. Suddenly you start to see, exceptional people in areas that you hadn't, including your field, that you hadn't expected. And that will focus the way you think about people. Because remember, when you're standing in front of a class, whether it's on Teams or in an actual classroom, what you need to do is, and believe, is that those students sitting in front of you can be where you are sitting, leading the class, leading the lecture, or leading some research. And you have to have that mindset switch. And if you don't have that mindset switch, it's not going to happen. That's overcoming those level 2, those implicit biases that I've spoken about. I'm almost near the end. Get to know people from different racialized groups on a deeper level, not just as acquaintances. So you see your black colleague, your Asian colleague wandering down the corridor. Just do more than just saying hello. Okay, again, you'll get to know what they're doing, what they're thinking. You might be surprised that this person might be quite doing something that you might be interested in. Invite a black colleague to collaborate on a research project, and that does not include race. I get invited to do lots of projects to do with race. Yet, as I said, I'm a scientist, I'm a toxicologist, I'm a biochemist, I'm a pharmacologist. All those areas really do people want to collaborate. They happily come and talk to me about race, but less about my science. So you need, again, that's about perceptions and bias. Okay, so the Open University has to do more as an institution to expose its staff and students to positive narratives about race. You can't do it all yourself. Your institution has to show that, show positive narratives about race, about racialized people, and that will lead the way. Because the thing about, I don't know if you heard about the campaign, Why Isn't My Professor Black? One of the advantages of having more black professors is that white staff can actually see black staff in senior positions, and that will change their perceptions about black students, this idea that a student can get to where I am. If you've never seen a black professor, when you're teaching your students, you'll never believe that they can reach your level. Don't be afraid to call out bias, discrimination, racism when you see or experience it. If you don't, you are enabling it. That's really important. You have to be part of the process. So you need to become an ally, or more ideally an accomplice in the fight for social justice. So you have to be an active participant, not just to sort of sit there and say, yes, I don't, it's the thing about being anti-racist as opposed to non-racist. These are really important things. I think Professor Marcy Wilson, your new member of staff, your new leader in these issues, will talk to you a lot about. So if you have never seen racism or racialized behavior, ask yourself why. Because again, someone will say, I've never seen that. Clearly you're not looking properly, you're not thinking about it. And then also own up to your own biases and even call yourself out, just sort of say to myself, did I really do that? and then reflect and think about it, and then that will change things. Okay, I think this is the last one, and I call this one the take back to the classroom slide. And again, it's just to remind you of the things I've been saying. So is the fact that we live in a highly racialized world. Many things are distorted by race, and we need to combat that. Racialization leads to bias and inequalities in university outcomes. BME students, we have to do that. So to remove the awarding gap, we must, as I said, allocate academic privileges in a more equitable way, which we're not doing at the moment. Mark assessment, how we mark assessment of certain students, because of our perceptions about students, it's only a small, all it takes is a few percentages. We seem to change our marks for certain students. That will have an impact. And also who we suspect of academic misconduct. All of these things will lead into the awarding gap. So thank you very much. And I think my presentation is over. So thank you very much. I don't know if I actually went over time or not, actually.
You didn't. You were absolutely smack on time. Thank you very much indeed, Winston. That was excellent. As you'd probably imagine, there was lots and lots of sort of texture in there. And I've been trying to sort of pick out some of the questions as we've been going along. Mm-hmm. I think the interesting thing from some Open University perspective is we've got a lot of staff in the room who are associate lecturers or tutors. So the way in which it works at the Open University is groups of students are allocated to those tutors who are working remotely, and in many cases they don't actually see the students. So in order to sort of identify whether they are black or not, but we still have an attainment gap. So I'd just be interested to know your sort of comments around that kind of issue.
Well, that's quite an interesting, because as I said, this is a shortened version of the presentation I do, because I go into a bit about marking and assessments, and I always say we use, for example, student numbers when we're marking. But really is a piece of work marked where the tutor doesn't know or think they know the identity of the student in some way or another. And that's what I find. I mean, I don't know the specifics of exactly how you can teach without ever sort of like having those kind of conversations. And if you don't know your students, that could also be a problem, surely. That you have to get to know your students and their experiences, and from that you build up a picture of who they are, and then those biases will come through. So to say that you don't actually see your students, there are other ways of identifying who those students are, and then those biases will then kick in, and then you will start to decide whether they're going to be a good student or a bad student, and then or a poor student, I should say, and then allocate them those academic privileges, etc. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you have. I mean, interesting. One of the debates that we're currently having at the moment is whether to indicate to our tutors the ethnicity of the student that they've actually got, because we don't. That's not something that we actually pass on. We don't routinely collect that information, but we guess we could do, and we could supply it. And in many ways, that would be helpful, surely.
Well, whether you have it or not, as I said, if you're going to have any kind of meaningful interaction with a student, you will know who they are in terms of, I don't see how that, perhaps I'm just thinking from because I've never taught at the Open University, so I don't know that specific model, but I can't see how, as a tutor, you won't know that kind of information about the student. There are sort of clues in the language. There are just so many ways you can tell, I think, or you, even if you don't tell, in a sense, you might think you know, because that's one of the other things. Either you know or you think you know, and then you make assumptions.
I mean, one of the things that we've attempted to do at the Open University is have unconscious bias training, and I'm interested in how you consciously check for your bias. You were saying that in a session that's sort of something that you try and do. So how do you do it in a sort of like a short, medium, and long term?
Well, as I said, it's just first of all, I acknowledge that I have biases, and I said a lot of people don't, academics, particular scientists, because of the way you're trained as a scientist. The idea is that you put bias to one side and you're objective, but in reality, especially when we're interacting with people, that can't happen, or it doesn't happen. The reality is you do have bias, so it's just being aware that you have them, and when you're marking a piece of work, you don't assume because you know who that student is, or you think that's it. So you then sort of you double check to find those extra marks for that particular student that you think, oh, this is a good student. Why, have I made a mistake as a marker? or when another type of student, as I said, who has never performed well suddenly comes up with a brilliant piece of work, you think, right, did I make a mistake again? And am I being too generous here? That kind of thing. Because remember, we're marked where we normally have moderators or second markers, and we don't want to. How can I make a mistake for them? So we'll try and reinforce our stereotypes about our students. I had a former dean who he was very restricted in where his external examiners would come from, because his perception was the students in his department, I won't say which department it was so poor that if he had say for example an external examiner from a Russell Group university, there'd be issues because his perception of his students, that kind of thing. I'm sort of going all over the place there, but I hope you understand the point I'm trying to make. So bias and perceptions about students impacts on a lot in terms of what we do and how we teach them and how we assess them. Because also, as I said, a lot of the damage is done well before the assessment. It's the guidance you give them, the privileges you give them beforehand. So when a student produces a piece of work, it may not be up to a good degree level simply because we haven't provided them with the necessary support in the first place. So then you can justify to yourself, the external examiner will agree with you, oh yeah, this is actually the right mark. It is the right mark because that student didn't get the support in the first place. And then I said we don't have time. But again, even when students do produce work of the right quality, there are still questions about giving the reluctance to give the student those marks. So there's just so much there that what I'm trying to do is switch the focus away from what the student is doing and how we can make the students better, because I think we're really good at that already. And all the data shows that as I said, that widening participation students, if you take away race, then you can't distinguish between a widening participation white student and a middle class white student in terms of their degree outcomes, because of how we become so good at inclusive teaching. Whereas for black students, that's still persisting, and it's persisting because race is playing a factor, discrimination, bias is playing a factor, and we don't like to admit it.
It's really interesting. To what extent do you think there are biases present in how assessments are actually written and structured, on top of then how a particular mark scheme might be applied?
Well, as I said, when I was first asked, my view is that a good black, because that's why I go back to the Russell Group students, how you write black students, there are no differences between how a black student can cope with an assessment versus a white student can cope with assessment, if everything else is equal. I don't see why, when I was a student, I didn't need a special assessment written for me because I'm black. So changing the assessments in themselves isn't the issue. There are other, and that's what I'm saying. We tend to go down this route. Oh, these students have deficits. So if we could write a culturally sensitive, assessment, that might somehow make them better. But I don't think that's the issue. That's not where we should be going. Black students, Asian students, whatever type of students, they can cope with any assessments that we can set, just as the white students can. Okay, it's how we teach those students, the privileges we give to those students. That's the important thing.
That's interesting. Diane, is there anything else you want to come in from the questions?
Thanks, Winston. This is so informative. This is really helpful to get your perspective on these issues. Can I just ask about whether black students see themselves represented in their teachers and in their tutors across the whole institution of the Open University, so both their associate lecturers and everybody else that they encounter? What sort of a difference does that not seeing yourself and your and other black staff, does that make a difference to the perception of your sense of belonging to the institution that you're a student of?
It makes a difference, but it's not as big a difference as people would like you to believe. The thing about you can't be what you can't see. That's the mantra that people say. But I always say you can't be what others can see. So for example, if your tutors can't see you getting a first or a 2-1, those, yeah, you're not going to get it. It doesn't matter whether you see it or not. It's what your tutors see in you that's the important thing, rather than what you see in yours. It doesn't matter how ambitious, because people talk about motivation and engagement and all those things. You can be highly motivated to want to do a really good project, but if the project supervisor isn't seeing you in that same way, it isn't going to make a difference. And we comfort ourselves by thinking, right, they're not motivated, they don't feel they belong, and that's the problem. Students, especially by the time the thing about the awarding gap is the data comes from level 6 students primarily, so those students who've gone through the process. By the time the students get to that level, they know how to cope with those my discriminatory practices, those what's the word I'm trying to look for? Never mind. But you understand, they can cope with that. So that's not an issue. But what they can't cope with and what they can't do anything about is whether they're going to be given those academic privileges that will enable them to produce the work, the criticality, the content, all of those things that we're looking for at the end. And that's the issue. And that's why I want to put it back on tutors rather than say, right, change the assessment so that students can feel. That's not the issue. I don't think it really is.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I think we're probably running out of time now, aren't we, Carlton?
We are indeed. Time to move to our next session.
Okay. Yes. So thank you very much.
I just want a huge thank you for coming to talk to us this morning under these rather strange circumstances. But it's been really interesting, and I'd love to follow up with you afterwards. And I know Marcia has been listening, and we've got lots of work to do in this particular area, which we're very determined to do. So a huge thank you for coming this morning.
Thank you. But I'd also think about this idea of whether you need to, this, because your model is slightly different, where you have your tutors don't say they don't know who the students are, which is quite interesting. But yeah, thank you very much.
I think there's something very interesting there to unpack. Why do we still have a 32% good degree awarding gap when the ethnicity of our students is not obvious? They can pick it up from clues, as you said, but it's not directly obvious to the students to the tutors, because they don't meet face to face very often. So really interesting. I think there's a good comparative study there to do between the OU and another institution, definitely.
Okay.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.